I would like to welcome everybody, especially our new people, to this event tonight. And it's a very special pleasure to have you here tonight at this talk um, at the Ancient India and Iran Trust. Now, the Ancient India and Iran Trust is a charity based in Cambridge. It's housed in a beautiful Victorian building just next to the Botanical Garden in Cambridge. And it was founded by Sir Harold Bailey and 4 other scholars who have a passionate interest in India and Iranian civilization. The speciality of the trust is that it covers both India and Iran as a large cultural complex, and it studies it from a great variety of disciplines, and that includes linguistic, literature, history, archaeology, and art. And we have a very special library focusing on covering these various aspects of India and Iran. We are called the Ancient India and Iran Trust, but as you will also see from today's lecture, we are by no means confined to ancient. And in fact, ancient is quite a flexible term. And so is present. The present has deep roots in the past. And when we look at phenomena even of today, we can very quickly get deeply involved in conversations about where things come from and how they developed. So much just briefly about the Ancient India and Iran Trust. It's a very special pleasure to welcome Dinya Patel to this event tonight. Dinya is a newly appointed assistant professor of history at the S.P. Jain Institute of Management and Research in Mumbai. And he just told me he started this August, so just a few months ago, in the middle of the lockdown. And he has been teaching online ever since he started on his new job at the S.P. Jain Institute. Before he came there, he took up his job there. He was assistant professor of history at the University of South Carolina, where he held a Fulbright and National Endowment for Humanities fellowships. Dinya teaches courses on modern South Asia, on the Indian nationalist movement, and on the British Empire. So he is a historian of modern India, and he focuses on Indian nationalism, the city of Mumbai or Bombay, and on the Zoroastrian Parsi community. It's a special pleasure for me to welcome Dinya because Dinya has a long-standing connection with the Ancient India and Iran Trust. His first involvement with the trust reaches back to 2008, when he participated in a conference on Zoroastrians past and present. At that time, he was a PhD student at Harvard University, working on his PhD on the grand old man Dadabhai Naoroji and the evolution of the demand for Indian self-government in the field of modern South Asian history. And this, his PhD was awarded in May 2015. Since then, Dinya has been back to the trust, and that was in 2012 when he gave a talk at the Ancient India and Iran Trust. And at that talk, he was introduced by the late Professor John Hinnels. Most of Dinya's research thus has focused on the life and the career of Dadabhai Naoroji, who lived from 1825 to 1917. And Dadabhai Naoroji was arguably the most significant Indian nationalist leader before Gandhi. He was one of the founders of the Indian National Congress and became the first Indian elected to the British Parliament in 1892. And in 1906, he declared swaraj, or self-government, to be the policy of the Indian National Congress. So it is an immense pleasure for me to welcome you, Dinya, and we very much look forward to your talk on Naoroji, pioneer of Indian nationalism in India.
Thank you very much, Almut. So I'd like to begin, first of all, by thanking the Ancient India and Iran Trust for inviting me here. And especially, I'd like to thank Munija for organizing this event and for Almut for holding it. And thanks to everyone for participating virtually, and greetings from Bombay or Mumbai. So the talk that I will give today is an overview of this book, which came out a few months ago, a biography of Dadabhai Naoroji. And at the heart of my book and this talk as well are two interrelated questions. How did an Indian get elected to the British Parliament in the year 1892? And secondly, why? Why would an Indian, a Parsi from Bombay, want to get elected to the British Parliament? And why would British individuals vote for him and have him as their representative for a term in Parliament? These questions just scratch the surface of what is quite a remarkable career, which I'll try to elucidate in the course of today's talk. Naoroji, as Almut mentioned, was someone who was the most important nationalist before Gandhi, but he was much more than that. He was an anti-colonial thinker, he was an economic analyst, he was someone who participated in anti-colonial activities that really spanned the ends of the world. I mean, his name and his ideas were circulating in places like the United States and South Africa, Cyprus, even in rather unexpected places like Bulgaria or China. So the story is quite long and complex, in large degree because Naoroji lived for a long time. I mean, by the time he died, he was nearly 92 years old, and it's a story that's been curiously neglected. India does not have many good biographies on important individuals. I mean, even if you take a figure like Gandhi or Nehru, there are a handful of good quality biographies. There are reams and reams of terrible biographies, but the scholarship for biography has not developed very well. And for Dadabhai Naoroji, there have been maybe 2 or 3 good books on Naoroji. But the last real effort to engage with his collection of papers took place about 80 years ago by someone who actually knew Naoroji. So I think one of the important reasons for why very little work has been done on Naoroji is because the body of material that's available is forbiddingly vast, and it's not always in the best of conditions. So if you go to the National Archives of India in New Delhi, you'll see his collection, and the boxes that you see over here represent only about half of the collection. There are about 30,000 documents here, and the items in the collection are not in terribly good condition. So we know during Naoroji's lifetime, perhaps around 60,000 documents were part of this collection, of which only half or so survives. And of that half, not all of it is properly catalogued, and that which is catalogued, the actual items themselves are not very well kept. They'll fall apart depending on how you touch them and handle them. So this oftentimes would be what I would have to work with. It was a rather excruciating process. But it was also quite rewarding because since so few people had dealt with this material beforehand, I was really the first person to look at this material in at least 80, perhaps 100 or longer that 80 years or so in time. So it was quite exciting to put together this story for the first time in many cases since it originally transpired. So for the rest of the talk, I'll try to go chronologically through Naoroji's life. And that life began in Western India, not far from where I'm speaking today. Naoroji, his family had its roots in the town of Navsari, of which many of you are probably familiar. It's a relatively small town by Indian standards, of course, so only 200,000 people or so, which is located in Gujarat near Surat. And for centuries, it's been a central place for the Parsi community. It's been a place where the priesthood has had one of its 2 main bastions. And Naoroji came from a priestly family that could trace back its ancestry right to the first individual who apparently set up his religious practice in the town. So this was, a rather illustrious religious family which he came from. But by the time that Naoroji was born, his family was in Bombay. He was born in a district called Khadak, which is today coterminous approximately with the area of Bendi Bazaar. So for those of you who are familiar with Bombay, when you're traveling on JJ flyover between the old Victoria Terminus or what is today CST on the way to JJ Hospital, you're going past his own neighborhood. You're technically going over his own neighborhood. And the reason why his family moved there was to a large degree because of the poverty that had stalked India during the beginning of British rule. Famine, plagues, epidemic diseases. These were quite common in Bombay, and Western India, Gujarat in the early 1800s. And so the family moved to Bombay for better economic prospects. They located in a part of the city which was relatively poor, not very well off. And so Naoroji began his life in relative poverty, and that childhood upbringing really, in many ways, I think, influenced the direction which Naoroji took politically. Now, at a relatively young age, Naoroji's father passed away around the age of 4 or 5. And this actually probably saved him from a career in the Parsi priesthood. He quite likely would have taken up his father's vocation and become a hereditary priest in the Naoroji family line. His widowed mother instead enrolled him in a unique experiment in public education that was going on in Bombay. A group of wealthy Indians and Britons had put together something called the Bombay Native Education Society, which offered free education to deserving Indians, regardless of what their economic status was. So Naoroji was probably one of the poorest children in the school, but he also distinguished himself as being one of the brightest and certainly one of the most gifted. And so, here you have a very poor Indian student given an opportunity to study at the best primary and secondary school in Bombay and learn in the English language. So these are phenomenal advantages for any individual from his particular location in society. And it continued throughout his early life. From this public school, he was enrolled in Elphinstone College. The building that you see on the screen is of the current quarters of Elphinstone. This was not where Naoroji attended school. Elphinstone was closer to, for those of you who are familiar with Bombay, Metro Cinema, Dhobi Talao, in that part of the city. That's where Elphinstone was located at the time. And Elphinstone was, really up until recently, one of the premier institutions for higher education in Western India. And it was here that Naoroji had an incredible experience being influenced by some of the greatest minds in Western India. His professors were Irishmen, Englishmen, and Scotsmen, and many of them had intellectual lineages that went back to things like the Scottish Enlightenment. So a lot of the Scottish Enlightenment's emphasis on rationality, logic, even things like mathematics and science, these were handed down to Naoroji and his classmates through his teacher and his teachers. But at the same time, he also had the benefit of having Indian professors. There were one or two quite gifted Indian professors who were teaching everything from calculus to Shakespeare to Naoroji and his colleagues. He really developed at this age a tradition of being quite a polymath. He distinguished himself in economics, in history, as well as things like physics, mathematics, political economy. So he became quite a well-rounded individual who was singled out by his professors for being brilliant in all aspects. So he finished his education in the mid-1840s. And in the 1840s, it was very difficult to do anything quite productive with the college education. You could go into government service, but you could only go so far because Indians could only advance so far in that bureaucracy. You could go into some commercial vocation, but college education was not very well valued in that day in a merchant house, a place like, say, for example, Jamshedji Gigi Boys or the Sassoon's Industries. So Naoroji made the quite appropriate decision to go back to school. He rejoined Elphinstone as an instructor and moved up the ranks to become eventually a professor. So here you see, an actual test paper from Naoroji's classes in mathematics. And he steadily moved up the ranks, becoming, assistant professor and finally full professor in 1854. And he was the first ever Indian appointed as a full professor in a British-run educational institution. Now, that distinction is quite a mouthful, but it is nevertheless significant. Professorial positions were, up until the early 20th century, largely a monopoly of Britons who came over from the United Kingdom. Relatively few Indians were appointed to the rank of professor, and Naoroji had that opportunity in the year 1854, decades before that became commonplace for many other Indians. Now, while Naoroji was engaged in his work as a professor, he also branched out into other areas of life. And in particular, he was drawn into activities that encompassed social reform, religious reform, and eventually political reform. The 1840s and the 1850s were a burst of reformist activity in Bombay that in many ways were influenced by these rationalist and reformist ideas that were being inculcated in places like Elphinstone. And one of the ways this reformist spirit was channeled was through development of female education. Up until the 1860s or so, very few Parsi girls were admitted to schools of any sort. I mean, Parsis were as backward as any other community in India, perhaps more backward even than other communities. I mean, we have records of Muslims and Hindus educating their daughters, but not so many Parsi men educating their daughters. And so Naoroji was part of the first wave of Indians to really set up schools for girls in Bombay. And it was a movement that elicited a great degree of challenge from orthodox Parsi men. But through persistence, Naoroji and his colleagues were able to set up a handful of schools, and within a span of about 5 years or so, they had hundreds of girls on their enrollment books, and they really started the ball rolling for female education throughout Western India. And this was a program that was not just amongst Parsi girls, but amongst Hindus and amongst Muslims, Maharashtrians, Gujaratis. So it really snowballed from this small effort in Bombay to encompass places as far away as Ahmedabad, Ahmednagar, and elsewhere in Western India. So that was one activity which Naoroji distinguished himself at an early age, and it was linked to another idea which he developed, which was some sense of equality between the sexes. Naoroji was quite an early and vocal proponent for gender equality in India. As early as the 1880s, he's giving quite progressive pronunciations about how both women and men should enjoy the same privileges and rights. And we'll see how this developed later on in his life in terms of his support for people like British feminists or even American feminists. Now, I talked about religious, social, and political reform. So at least in the aspect of religious reform, within the Parsi community, he did a lot with other individuals, like, say, Naoroji Fardunji, who was one of his contemporaries, and actually one of his professors at Elphinstone, to further a process whereby the party was desensitized. These ideas of rationality and reform to the religion, certain ideas and beliefs that were thought to be inauthentic, that thought to be Hindu or Muslim or what have you, were weeded out. It was a controversial process, but Naoroji nevertheless played quite an important role, especially through an organization called the Renome Mazda Sabha, which was the premier reformist organization in this era. But he also participated in some rather offbeat and quite interesting activities. So, in this era, the domains of women and men were divided in all aspects of life, not just amongst Parsis, but amongst any Indian. So, in Parsi households, it was very rare for men and women to eat together, which is, something we might find as being quite odd today, given what the community is like. But in this time, it was custom for women to serve their menfolk first, and only after the men were done eating would they actually have the opportunity to eat. So Naoroji and some of his friends, Karshiji Manakji, for example, set up an association that promoted the idea that men and women could eat together and enjoy each other's social company, without one gender taking precedence over the other. So this all fed into this period of time that was known as Young Bombay, which, as I mentioned, was a movement where all sorts of reformist activities were going on, and eventually percolated into the realm of political activities. The first major political association in Western India was set up in 1851, and not surprisingly, Naoroji was there, and he remained an active member of society throughout his life. Now, I'll move on to the second part of my talk. In the year 1855, Naoroji decides to leave India and sail to Great Britain. And what I will do is move a little chronologically in time and then switch back to this moment of arrival in Great Britain. So I can talk a little bit about Naoroji's activities with the wider Zoroastrian community. So when Naoroji goes to Great Britain in 1855, he is one of perhaps a few dozen Parsis living in the country. There were hardly any Parsis living in London or Liverpool or Edinburgh at this time. And not surprisingly, most of the time they lived together. They stuck to a lot of religious traditions and cultural traditions. They would refuse to eat food that was cooked by non-Zoroastrians. And so Naoroji was part of a group of people who set up the diasporic infrastructure in Great Britain, much of which survives today. So the ZTFE, for example, Naoroji was one of the founding members, and he became secretary and eventually president of the society through the year 1907. So he was in many ways the defining figure of the first 50 or so years of this organization. And he helped establish things like Brookwood, the Parsi and Zoroastrian cemetery, which is still in use by the community. Elsewhere, Naoroji became a very important scholarly middleman, if you will. Now, Naoroji also dabbled in Zoroastrian scholarship, which is something I really didn't even have time to get into in the book. There are many components of Naoroji's life which are impossible to encapsulate in a 250-page book. But Naoroji, was a member of a wider circle of Orientalists and academics in Western Europe, in the United Kingdom, Germany, France, elsewhere. And whenever these academics, people like Max Muller or Mills or Danstetter and others, wanted help in studying Zoroastrianism, specifically wanted help in getting in touch with people in Bombay, say priests like Jivanji Modi, scholar priests like Jivanji Modi or K.R. Kama, they went through Naoroji. And Naoroji helped foment the links between Western Orientalists and Indian scholars, and also the resources of the Parsi community. People like Lawrence Mills tried to get the BPP to fund their research, and Naoroji helped him. So he played, quite an interesting role in these scholarly networks. And these scholarly networks that, again, span the world at this time, played an unusual and unique role in another activity which Naoroji was involved in, which was helping improve the conditions of the Zoroastrians in Iran, which, unlike the Parsis, suffered from a great degree of persecution and were quite poor and very few in numbers by the 1850s. And here, not surprisingly, once more we find Naoroji getting involved in these activities from the 1850s onward. And once he was in London, Naoroji used his networks within the scholarly community in order to perform diplomatic leverage with the Iranian government. So Dadabhai Naoroji and Naoroji Fardunji, who are the two individuals you see at the top right-hand portion of the screen, found out in 1873 that the Shah of Iran, Nasser al-Din Shah, was coming to London in order to visit. He visited Queen Victoria and toured a lot of the other countries of Western Europe, and they decided it would be a good idea to present him to him, asking for the Shah and his government to be kinder towards Iranian Zoroastrians, get rid of things like the jizya tax and other oppressive measures against them. And this was a difficult task to do. I mean, how do you reach out to the head of a government of which you have no ties whatsoever? And the way they did this was by going through, again, scholarly networks, who in turn put them in touch with other people like Malcolm Khan, who was the Persian ambassador in London at the time. And consequently, they had a chance to meet Nasser al-Din Shah at Buckingham Palace in 1873. And this started the process whereby the jizya tax was eventually repealed by the late 1870s and early 1880s. So Naoroji played a diverse and very international role from his home base in London. And he lived in either London or Liverpool for a good 4 decades of his life. And this is really where much of his scholarly, political, economic, and social takes place. So Now we're going to zoom back in time to the moment of when Naoroji arrives in Europe. The thing that strikes him more than anything else, as a young man coming from India to Europe, is the wealth of Europe. He goes through places like Aden and Egypt, and by and large, these places seem similar to India. There are things like railways and telegraphs, but there are also thousands upon thousands of poor and uneducated people. But when he goes through Europe, when his boat lands up first in Marseille and he goes through France and stops in Paris and eventually makes his way onto Southampton, London, and Liverpool, he sees a completely different world. This is a world where everyone seemed very prosperous, where even the farmers seemed to have abundance at their fingertips. There was science and technology. Poverty was there, but it was a very different poverty from what you had in the West. So this really got him to start thinking about why India was so poor in comparison to the rest of the world. Now, Naoroji began his business career in London through cotton. Cotton was the main industry of the time. It was kind of the IT industry or the oil industry of the time in Bombay. This was an industry whereby Bombay's fortunes rose and fall. And Naoroji's fortunes rose and fall with it. I mean, he grew spectacularly rich in the early 1860s, and by 1866, he was bankrupt due to the dynamics of the cotton market. These observations, working within international cotton networks, seeing the wealth of Europe in comparison to the poverty of India, really started to get him thinking about what was going on, politically and economically, and things like the American Civil War, which caused, Indian cotton profits to skyrocket and then collapse once the Civil War ended, showed him that India was connected to a much larger global economic network, within which Indians had very little control. The markets in New York or Liverpool were controlling India's economic destiny. And at the same time, the other and last real major input on his thought were these spates of famine that started occurring from the late 1850s onward. Between the 1850s and the 1910s, India suffered a catastrophic series of famines where upwards to 30 to 50 million people may have died. And so when famines such as the Orissa famine take place, where 1 out of every 3 people in Orissa die due to malnutrition and disease, Naoroji again starts to think, why is this taking place in India and not in any other part of the quote-unquote civilized world? So here is where Naoroji begins to form his economic scholarship on poverty and something that he calls the drain of wealth. Naoroji decided to take the idea that colonialism was making India rich, and imperialism was a beneficial force for India, and turn that idea on its head. He was convinced that that was not the case, and what he started to do was go through reams of economic evidence that was collected by the British, and he supplemented it with his own evidence, and then he took the evidence that the British collated, and he showed why it was wrong. So if you look at his writing, you'll see images like this, where he shows economic data, and then there's a margin on the side where he says, no, this is absolutely wrong, this is misleading, this is incorrect data, we can't go by it. And what he proved at the end of these efforts, along with his, again, his own inputs, he traveled through parts of Western India, observing poverty and observing agricultural conditions, he proved that Indians were actually grievously poor, far poorer than any British official wanted to admit. His most famous statistic made in the year 1876, where he calculated something that's roughly equivalent to what we today would call GDP per head, so national income. He took, he created a rough estimate of India's gross domestic product, divided it by the population of India, and came to the rather startling statistic that, the average Indian could rely upon £2 per year for their livelihood. And as a point of comparison, the average Briton, who was not very rich at this time, right, could rely on £33. So the average Briton is about 15 times richer than the average Indian. And through his scholarship, he showed just how little you could do as an Indian off 40 shillings or £2. If you were a coolie, someone who's being transported to, say, Mauritius or Malaysia on a boat, 30, 40 shillings is just barely enough to keep you alive. If you are in prison that amount, again, is just barely enough to keep you alive. So if you are a farmer and you are having to look after your family, you have to worry about seasonal discrepancies in your crops. There's the prospect of famine. What could you do, really? I mean, so he said, in conclusion, it's no surprise that if a slight change in the monsoon takes place, very quickly millions of people fall into starvation-like conditions and a famine ensues. Okay, so this outlines the idea of the fact that India was very poor, and Naoroji went a step further and identified British rule as being directly responsible for this poverty. He identified something called the drain of wealth, whereby he proposed that out of all the revenue that was collected in British India every year, about 1/4 of it was funneled out of the country and went into British coffers, either administratively or through British businesses. So every year India grew 1/4 poorer, and this was kind of a cyclical process that went on year after year after year. So over a period of about 15 years, Naoroji develops his economic ideas into a very starkly and very kind of forward-looking political idea. So British rule impoverished India; it caused this drain of wealth. So what was the solution to that? The solution was to put Indians actually in positions of power in their own government. This would only be possible if you took the Indian civil service, which was staffed almost unanimously with Britons, and put Indians in that position. So you opened up the civil service to Indians. You got rid of the official and unofficial restrictions against them. And once the civil service had a good number of Indians, it would start to reflect Indian economic concerns and Indian political concerns, and it would form the first step on the way to swaraj or self-government. So as early as 1884, and this is, keep in mind that, Swaraj becomes, a goal of the Congress only in 1906, and Puran Swaraj, the idea of full independence for India, is adopted by the Congress only in 1930. But as early as 1884, Naoroji is starting to talk about this idea. And this is really the earliest that any, mainstream nationalist is talking about something approaching independence. So it's a really decisive moment. And when Naoroji engaged with economic ideas, he did so with ideas from around the world and with people from around the world. So if you look at his writing, he's engaging with the writings of John Stuart Mill, who was not always very favorable towards India, but he took his ideas on capital and how capital was necessary for economic development, and once more turned it on its head and showed how the norms of normal economic laws were being violated under conditions of colonialism. He also perhaps had an influence on the ideas of Karl Marx. Both Marx and Naoroji had a common friend, Henry Hinman, who was an important socialist leader. And towards the very end of Marx's life, you start to see Marx talking about a drain of wealth. And it is quite likely that the drain of wealth idea that Marx is talking about was indirectly influenced by Naoroji's writings. So this is really the first major stage of Naoroji's political career. And now we get to the second stage, which is where Naoroji engages in British politics. So, we're going back to that question I began with. Why was an Indian running for parliament? Why was it, how could an Indian possibly get elected to the British parliament? Now, in this era, Indian nationalists like Naoroji knew that if they wanted to achieve any sort of reform in India, they had to do it not in India itself, but in Great Britain, because they were completely powerless in India. There was, a reactionary government in power, no democratic institutions, but Parliament technically was in control of British Indian policy, and there were people in Parliament, like John Bright, for example, even Gladstone to a degree, who were quite sympathetic toward Indian concerns. So Naoroji joined the Liberal Party, and he became an active member of its political establishment. And in the year 1886, he stands for the first time for election for Parliament. And his idea was that if he could get elected to the British Parliament, he could bring Indian concerns right to the floor of the House of Commons and again start the process of getting political reform in the direction of self-government. And this was a process whereby, again, you see Naoroji being influenced by ideas from all elements of society and indeed ideas from around the world. So one major input on Naoroji's philosophy in this era is Irish nationalism. When the first Indian nationalists meet Irish nationalists, they see much in common. They see eye to eye. Because both of their countries had suffered from famines, both of them chafed at what they perceived as unfair colonial rule, and both wanted a degree of self-government. So Naoroji immediately befriends people like Michael Davitt, who was quite a radical figure. I mean, he had just recently been released from prison, and Davitt in turn introduces Naoroji to a galaxy of Irish nationalists, both in Great Britain and in Ireland, people like Parnell. There's a moment where people like Davitt actually suggest that Naoroji stand for Parliament from Ireland in order to kind of tie together an anti-colonial platform representing both India and Ireland. So you could have had quite a remarkable situation, an Indian representing an Irish constituency in a British Parliament. It unfortunately did not come to pass. The other major component of Naoroji's ideas was socialism. Socialism was developing as an important philosophy, and Henry Hinman, who's the founder of the SDF, the Social Democratic Federation, was one of Naoroji's greatest friends. He was someone who propagated the idea of a drain of wealth, and you start to see a very close collaboration between the two from roughly 1880 onward, right up until 1906, the year that Naoroji kind of retires from Parliament. So the product of all of these influences, again, is quite dramatic and in many ways unexpected. You see Naoroji, engaging with feminists in Great Britain, which built both upon his engagement with women's issues in India and his engagement with people like socialists or progressives in the Liberal Party. So Naoroji met and befriended and was a very important, supporter of people like Emmeline Pankhurst and Josephine Butler. He probably knew people like Florence Fenwick Miller, Millicent Fawcett, individuals like that. He was regarded as someone by suffragists who was an ally. He pledged his support for the right of women to vote, and this was something that he tried to promote within the Liberal Party. So he became in many ways an advocate, not just for Indian women, but also for British women as well. So when Naoroji started to lecture to British audiences, he lectured with a particular frame in mind. He didn't just talk about why India needed political rights. He said, India needs those rights that you as women or you as workers or you as Irishmen want and need as well. So if you support us, we will support you. If you as Irishmen will support India will pledge its support for Irish political rights. And it was a strategy that worked quite well, and it allowed him to get nominated for the Liberal candidacy for Parliament once more. In the year 1888, he's nominated from Central Finsbury, the constituency that's roughly around what is today, so if you go to the Islington Museum, that's the heart of his old constituency. And this turned into a long and protracted campaign. It lasted for almost 4 years. Now, in his political program, you see India featuring, but at the very end. So before that was a whole gamut of other political ideas and platforms. So Irish Home Rule, the 8-hour workday, rights for labor, the right of, say, poor fruit vendors to peddle their wares on the street, which was coming under attack from rich people at that time. Self-government for London, improvement of governance, the expansion of the franchise beyond just a small minority of British voters. Remember, this is the time when various reform bills are working their way through Parliament. Again, this is how Naoroji built up his support. There was, of course, a large group of people who opposed his ideas and opposed his candidacy, nonetheless than the Prime Minister of Britain at this time. Lord Salisbury, who was the Conservative Prime Minister, very famously, in the year 1888, called Naoroji a black man who deserved not to be elected to the British Parliament, who was thought to be and comments like this actually probably helped Naoroji. It probably helped him win more support and sympathy. For the past few months, we've heard a lot about anti-racism in our contemporary context, right? Especially after protests in July and June of this year. Well, there was an anti-racist current in Victorian Britain, and Naoroji was right at the head of it. He was working with anti-racist activists, and many of these were the people who were helping him campaign election. Many of these people, again, feminists, Irish, these were people who were and knocking door to door in Finsbury, telling people to vote for Naoroji. And in 1892, it culminates in success. Naoroji wins. He wins by only 5 votes. Okay? So it's a very narrow victory, and consequently, Naoroji is known from that time as Dadabhai narrow majority. But he wins nevertheless. And so, here's a moment where, for the first time, an Indian is elected to the British House of Commons. Now, this is a point of historical controversy. There were certainly people of Indian ancestry who were elected in the past to the House of Commons, but this was the first time that anyone who self-identified as an Indian and who identified as someone who would champion India's political interests was elected to the British Commons. So, it was, nevertheless a very landmark moment. So you have a man who was portrayed a few years beforehand as a black man, now being portrayed as a colossus, such as in this cartoon, 1 foot in England, 1 foot in India. Now, up until this point, I've been talking exclusively about what's going on in Great Britain. Naoroji goes back to India occasionally. And when he goes back to India, he's greeted as a hero. And this really shows that, Naoroji was the first real major Indian nationalist leader, someone who enjoyed a wide degree of popular support. So when Naoroji returns to Bombay in 1893, for the first time since being elected to parliament, basically half the city comes out and greets him, about 500 people. And he goes on a whistle-stop train tour through lots of Western India and Northern India, up to Lahore, back down through Allahabad. And this becomes, in many ways, kind of the first kind of popular mass campaign of the nationalist movement in 1893. So this is very different and at variance from a lot of historical scholarship, which has talked about Indian nationalism being quite staid and impersonal. Now, going back into parliament, Naoroji was in parliament for about 3 years, and this became an increasingly frustrating experience for him. Naoroji realized that he could talk about reform before parliament, but only a handful of people would listen. And if you take Naoroji's political pronouncements through his time in parliament, you see that year on year they become more and more radical. So, by the end of his time in parliament, he's comparing Indians to slaves in America, African American slaves. And he's saying Indians are actually worse treated than slaves. So here's a man that's slowly getting radicalized. And he gets even more radicalized in 1895 when he loses election to parliament. So, a man who had built up the strategy of reform through parliament and through the British electorate now finds his whole strategy in tatters. And furthermore, he is in his 70s. Any sane man in this era would have retired and lived out his last few years. He decides to do the exact opposite, to kind of double down on his political activities and become more radical. And this is the last phase of his career where he makes a campaign for swaraj and self-government the centerpiece of his political strategy and his political campaign. And once more, you have dire influences from India. Famine once more devastated parts of India from 1895 onward, along with a plague epidemic which killed upwards to 10 to 20 million by the time plague finally abated by the 1910s. And while political impetus was coming from India, Naoroji's political vision expanded to include areas beyond the British Empire. So it's in this period that you start to see Naoroji engaging with people like American anti-imperialists. Or individuals from the West Indies who are campaigning against British rule, African Americans, even a handful of Africans or from other parts of the world who are streaming through places like London and Paris. So, perhaps the most fruitful cooperation that he built up outside of India and Great Britain was with Americans at this time. After the Spanish-American War, he engaged in a long series of correspondence with anti-imperialists in America, including people like William Jennings Bryan. And so a lot of Naoroji's ideas about a drain of wealth and how colonialism was bad and how imperialism would just cause more suffering and famines, this percolated into American political conversations as well. So you see people like William Jennings Bryan in the presidential campaign of the year 1900 in the United States, using a lot of Naoroji's arguments from the campaign hustings, talking about why the expansion of an American empire was a bad idea, and why colonialism was not good. Naoroji also turns his view east and engages with socialists in Europe. He attends a socialist conference in Amsterdam that was part of the second international, along with people such as Henry Hinman, Karl Kautsky, Jean Joas, Rosa Luxemburg. You can see Luxemburg right at the center of this photo, the only woman. And you start to see increasingly more input of socialist ideas in Naoroji's written output. He's talking more about capitalism, kind of a in a position of as of someone who is kind of starting to doubt the efficacy of capitalism and believe in socialist ideas of kind of this, a new economic structure that needed to be built where labor would be empowered to fight against capitalists. So he's being tied into much bigger and wider networks of European and indeed international socialist thoughts. And at the same time, he's engaging with Indians around the British Empire. Mohandas Gandhi, when he was in South Africa, reached out to Naoroji because Naoroji was, again, the preeminent nationalist of the time. And he basically asked Naoroji to be a mentor of sorts. And Naoroji fulfilled this function for a good 2 decades or so. They had, again, quite an extensive correspondence. And whenever Gandhi wanted people in London to know about what was going on to Indians in South Africa, he would write to Naoroji. And so you can see Gandhi's correspondence in the British Library being modulated through Naoroji and being sent to places like the Colonial Office or the India Office. And so Gandhi, really kind of looked up to Naoroji as kind of this, both a father figure politically and someone who was helping the cause of diasporic Indians. There were others beyond the pale of the British Empire, which Naoroji helped out with. So a lot of Pan-Africanist activity begun around the year 1900, and Naoroji and the Indian National Congress played a small role. The offices of the Indian National Congress in London were located just right by Westminster Bridge, just right across the street from Parliament, where Portcullis House is now. And just down the hall from the offices of the Congress was the office of the Pan-African Conference. So we know the two organizations were working and collaborating together. And increasingly, you start to see Africans and African Americans attending political meetings that Naoroji and other Indians are holding in London. Now, this is the very end of our story. The year 1906 was, in many ways, the most dynamic and active year of Naoroji's life. It was the most eventful. It was also the last year of his political life. He turned 80 that year. He did many things in this year. He stood for Parliament once more. He lost, but still a large number of people voted for him. He began to clamor for self-government for India. He did so originally by talking about self-government under British paramountcy, which left a lot of questions open about what that meant. Would India remain within the British Empire to a degree? He wrote to people like the British Prime Minister and said, you need to give us self-government actually as a form of reparations. So he was very early in this, still contemporary discussion of whether reparations are needed in colonialism. And he met Gandhi, who came to London to campaign for the rights of South African Indians. But most importantly, he went back to India to serve as the president of the Indian National Congress. And in 1906, the Congress was being kind of divided apart into two groups, a radical component and a moderate component. And Naoroji had always been regarded as the most radical and forward of Indian nationalists, but by this time, he was starting to kind of fit in the middle. Moderates regarded him as being too radical, and radicals regarded him as being too moderate. So Naoroji was kind of a compromise candidate. But he knew that in his presidency, he would navigate between. So, on one side, you have people like Gokhale, who are championing the moderate cause and who are a little wary about this idea of self-government. And on the other side, you have people like Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who you see on the right-hand side of this picture, who are arguing for immediate self-government, not necessarily within the British Empire. So who would Naoroji kind of hand off the baton to amongst this next generation? Well, the answer is quite clear, at least in my mind. If you look at Naoroji's speech, first of all, like all of his career, it's global in orientation. He's looking at democratic and political precedents in places like Japan, Russia, where Russia had a revolution in 1905 where a Duma was established. China was going through political change. Persia just had the constitutional revolution. So he said, why not India? Even in the Philippines, under American colonial rule, political reform was taking place, and why was this not happening in India? So he said ultimately India needed something like self-government or swaraj, and critically he qualified this by saying that this swaraj can be like what exists in the United Kingdom or what exists in the colonies. So it could be swaraj under British paramountcy or self-government under paramountcy of a colonial authority, or it could not. So this left the door open to something much more like Purn Swaraj, which is what the Congress, Gandhi and Nehru adopt in 1930. And so this really, I think, moves, the kind of center point of the Congress into the court of the radicals. And it's not surprising that the following year, in 1907, the Congress formally splits into a radical and moderate faction. And only when it comes back together, it's in a much more radical demeanor. So I think you can really credit Naoroji with a lot of this push and impetus away from moderate or what's called mendicant nationalism and towards something that was different. Now, surely it was limited. Naoroji did not believe in a lot of the tactics of, say, Tilak, but people like Tilak or even Bipan Chandra Pal, who was quite radical and revolutionary for his time, saw him as being more on their side than, say, the side of Firozshah Mehta or Gopal Krishna Gokhale. So with that, I will end. So in that year, Naoroji retires from political life. He lives his last decade in retirement. He is strangely forgotten after that. So, one of the purposes of this book is to kind of try to reintroduce Naoroji into our discussions of nationalism. Nationalism is a word that's being bounced around a lot in contemporary media. And Naoroji represents a type of nationalism that's very different from the nationalism that we see today in Britain or the United States or India. It was a nationalism that was very internationalist, that was emancipatory, that saw other people who were oppressed as partners, not people who could be oppressed by a government or a governing authority. So with that, I'll end, and I'll be happy to answer any questions which we might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dinya, for this fascinating presentation. And I must apologize to you for having failed to mention your book when I introduced you.
Oh, don't worry about it,
in this very year, 2020, Dinya published an important book on Dadabhai Naoroji, and it is, of course, much of what you were presenting to you was to us tonight is based on that work, on this very important work on Dadabhai Naoroji. And so we do have a little bit of time for questions now. May I please invite any comments or questions of someone who would like to ask something?
I think there's one question in the chat from William Crawley.
Yes, please.
Thank you for a great presentation. Contemporary historians, not least in Cambridge, condemn thinkers of the Enlightenment for their alleged failure to acknowledge the brutality and general evils of the slave trade. Does this affect the reputation of figures such as Naoroji, who are anti-imperialist, but as you show so convincingly, also children of the Enlightenment?
Scholarship is obviously like a pendulum, right? It sways backwards and forward, and so I take a much more nuanced view on that. I mean, obviously there are clear limitations to the liberalism that took place in the 1800s, and the limitations in that Enlightenment thought, but we can't deny that the ideas seeped out. Again, if you look at the work of people like Christopher Bailey, those ideas of the Enlightenment that were not meant necessarily for people like Indians were used by Indians and deployed by Indians and twisted and turned into ways that would have made people like John Stuart Mill not very happy, but nevertheless did the job and opened the door towards some broadening of the idea of liberalism. So I would not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Right? I think it's important to consider these people as well. And I think a lot more nuanced scholarship is coming out now, even about how within the empire it was possible to imagine more democratic spaces taking place. I just finished reading Miles Taylor's book on Queen Victoria, where he shows how a lot of historians kind of we brush aside references to Queen Victoria in the sources, and Victoria is everywhere. I mean, newspapers are really kinds of hint, from this era, which is the Empress of India, and it's a nationalist paper, and yet it's it has a huge, massive picture of Victoria on its frontispiece. So what gives? And history is complex, and so there are these contradictions whereby someone like Naoroji could be nationalist, could rally against imperialism, could see eye to eye with socialists, but at the same time could call himself a loyal subject of the Queen. That's what makes these individuals interesting, not because they are straightforward, but because there are complexities that really make us think and wonder, my God, this is very different from what I could anticipate or expect.
Yeah, thank you, Dinya. Now, there is another question here about from Shirin Patel. Earlier, you mentioned that Naoroji was not the first Indian in the British Parliament, and that there had been some of Indian heritage, as we say today. Would you be able to say who they were or point in their direction?
So the first person who is believed to be the first Indian, so to speak, in Parliament, though it's debatable how far in Parliament he got, was a man called Sombre, who was an Anglo-Indian from Sardana state in northern India. He was elected to Parliament around 1844. He did not identify as an Indian. I think he was of 5/8 European ancestry, and he probably did not sit in Parliament because he was quickly ejected on charges of bribery and corruption, and his election was reversed. So there is a book on Sombre by Michael Fisher, a scholar at Oberlin. But again, Sombre did not identify as an Indian. Naoroji was the first, and due to the high number of Britons who went over to India and had Indian wives or Indian concubines or what have you, there were a lot of people in the British aristocracy with some Indian blood, whether they acknowledged it or not. So, depending on how you define who an Indian is, there could have been a lot of forebears to Naoroji.
Yeah, thank you. Then we have another question here from Joe Cribb. Is Naoroji forgotten in India as he has been in the UK?
Yes, he is. I mean, I'm quite surprised by, how little, interest there is in him here in India, because, it represents a form of nationalism. Again, the nationalism which Naoroji or Gokhale or Ranade represent, certain ideas and philosophies which in many ways are quite needed today in the political atmosphere. Quite socially progressive, economically talking about the need for rapid economic development. It kind of takes a certain liberal idea and packages it in a distinctly Indian way. In a format you don't really see that much in mainstream Indian politics today. I think to a large degree, Naoroji is forgotten because he was Parsi after all. Again, even someone like Gokhale is not very well remembered today, and he's at least as a Maharashtrian and a Hindu. But Naoroji suffers from the fact that there hardly are any Parsis left. We have hardly any clout at all, it's ironic in that sense, because when Naoroji was alive, people really didn't identify him as being Parsi. They identified him as being Indian first and foremost. In fact, you see more Britons in, say, the Conservative Party questioning his ability to identify India than actual Indians, which again shows you how things have changed in both Britain and India in the ensuing 120, 130 years.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Dushka Sayed about Naoroji's relationship with Jinnah. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so Jinnah is another one of those figures who I search for, over and over and over in the papers, and out of around, I went through around 15,000 papers in the National Archives in New Delhi. I found only one reference to Jinnah, and it was very offhand, which surprised me because, Jinnah, at least if you read some of the biographies on Jinnah, Jinnah claims Naoroji to be one of his mentors. He claims that he was secretary to Naoroji, and I found no evidence of that whatsoever. Jinnah had a reputation to exaggerate his links to people, and it certainly does seem he exaggerated his links and ties to Naoroji. There's probably a good chance the two men met one another, perhaps conversed with one another, but we have solid evidence that Gandhi knew Naoroji and conversed with him and met on several occasions, and that evidence is really lacking with Jinnah, which is surprising, because at that stage, Jinnah's ideas were more in line with Naoroji's than, say, Gandhi's.
Mhm. Yeah. And then we have a question from Siddharth Saxena. You mentioned Naoroji's attention to what was happening in Persia, in Iran. Being a Parsi, did Naoroji have any particular view on what was happening there?
From the 1850s onward, you start to see Parsis growing increasingly interested in contemporary Persian affairs, politics, economics, and that is to a large degree because of the welfare of the Iranian Zoroastrian community, or in this stage, the lack of welfare. So Naoroji's interest in Iran begins through that, through these kind of philanthropic efforts on the parts of Bombay Parsis towards their Iranian co-religionists. But it expands beyond that focus. I mean, you start to see Naoroji meeting with Iranian diplomats, people like Malcolm Khan, the Shah, prime ministers of Iran who come through. And eventually, I've written about this elsewhere in some papers, Parsi interest in Iran broadens again to social and economic aspects that go well beyond the Zoroastrian community. By the 1930s, you have many Parsis who are actually talking about the need for Parsis to be repatriated in Iran, as silly as that sounds. Naoroji never reached that stage, but he was part of the initial process whereby Parsis got interested in contemporary Iran rather than, say, just ancient Iran.
Mm. And a question from Mark Lecky Thompson. Did Naoroji share the Ahimsa philosophy of Gandhi?
So Naoroji certainly did not believe in violence for achieving political objectives. Repeatedly he would say to people like, say, Henry Hinman, that he opposed violent tactics. Hinman actually advocated rebellion in India, and Naoroji said, no, that's something we want to avoid. I mean, people of Naoroji's generation, I think, were quite scarred by the Mutiny Rebellion of 1857 and wanted to make sure it wasn't repeated. So in that aspect, he was, in favor of constitutional, peaceful reform and protest, but he certainly did not have, the kind of the philosophical breadth and, he did not tap those intellectual traditions that Gandhi did. People like Gandhi, or say even Ranade, these were real intellectuals in the sense that they took ideas from thinkers around the world, from Thoreau to Tolstoy to, economic thinkers like List. Naoroji really did not have time for that. I mean, the whole goal of his life was just to tell people that India was pretty poor, people are dying right now because of poverty, and change needs to happen. He didn't really have time to talk about, well, we can explore some sort of Indic philosophy for, peaceful reform, or what does swaraj mean in the Indian context. He really had no time for that. He wanted to kind of get the job done. I mean, ultimately that job did not get done in his lifespan, but he brought a certain immediacy to his politics that left little room for kind of philosophizing.
And thank you. And then a question from Tejas Parashare. Do we know if Naoroji maintained any connections with European socialists like Hindman after he returned to India?
Thank you, Tejas, for that question. Yes, it's, both Naoroji and Hinman had politically kind of fallen out by this time, because, Hinman was now really kind of attacking his political direction to people like Shyamji Krishna Varma and the revolutionaries. They stayed in touch. They were still quite close friends. And they both helped to lend financial support for a rather quirky Maharashtrian inventor, a man called Shankar Abaji Bise. I've written an essay about him elsewhere. And so both Naoroji and Hinman actually worked together to kind of help bring Bise's inventions to fruition on the market. And so, if you look at their correspondence, it's quite funny. Hinman talks in one line about how rebellion needs to take place in India, and those dastardly Britons in India, what are they doing? And the next line he's talking about, I saw this man BC, he's developed a typewriter, and I, as a capitalist in London, would like to put up £500 for this effort. So it's kind of mind-bending conversation where people like Hinman and Naoroji are taking socialist ideas and along with the idea that they were involved in kind of capitalist ventures as well.
Thank you. And Dushka Said, who earlier asked about Jinnah, ask another question. So Wolpert's statement in his biography of Jinnah, that Jinnah was Naoroji's secretary at the Congress session of 1906, is that a fabrication?
I found no evidence in any of the Congress reports or Naoroji's own papers that Jinnah served in any sort of secretarial capacity. Now, there would have been dozens of secretaries working for Naoroji and his inner circle. Jinnah could have been one of them, but Naoroji never noticed it. His name did not appear as being associated with Naoroji in the 1906 Congress or before or after. Again, the only reference I found to Jinnah's name was, I think, in a letter of one of Naoroji's secretaries talking about, some report that Jinnah was getting, printed and published. So, Jinnah was at best at the very outer circles of Naoroji's, social world.
Thank you.
Sorry, Almut, there's one question that came to me privately by mistake from Adam Shakir.
Oh.
And how easy or difficult was it for Naoroji to travel from India to UK and Europe at the time?
It gets increasingly easier. You see this as you read the letters and you analyze his various trips. At the beginning, his first trip in 1855, it's a slog. He starts, I think, around June in 1855. I think, first of all, his boat nearly capsizes because of the monsoon, so it doesn't get off to a very good start. And you go through the Arabian Sea, you land up in Aden, and then you go to Egypt, and then you take a train from, I think, not Port Said, but maybe it was Port Said to Cairo, and you take a boat from Cairo to Alexandria, and then you take another boat to Malta, ... So it's cumbersome. By the last trips that he's making, it's pretty much a one-shot deal, right? You take a train to somewhere in Italy or France, board a boat, the boat goes through the Suez Canal, lands up in Bombay. So it's taking now maybe 2 weeks or so. 1 week if you're very lucky. At the outset, at the beginning, it's taking a month and a half. So one of the fun things of studying this period of history is you see how both communication and transportation become much more rapid, as the person's life proceeds.
Thank you. May I also ask a question? Dinya, you at the beginning of your talk, you spoke about how Naoroji championed female education in his very early days. What were his early influences there?
So I think in this era, again, it's a lot of the kind of liberal upbringing that he had in school. And this period of his life is very difficult to reconstruct because the letters from this period are all gone. They were all eaten up by insects or termites or what have you decades ago. So it's hard to put together these particular aspects of his life. But we know a little bit of the books that he was reading. He was certainly reading books on things like the emancipation of slaves in Great Britain around 1833. He was reading certain philosophical works that pointed in the direction of, maybe not equal rights, but something approaching it. So I think a lot of these ideas really influenced him. And as more reformist sentiment filters into Bombay through various means, I mean, there were indigenous reformist efforts within religious sects and movements in India, as well as kind of a reformist impulse by people like missionaries. Naoroji picks up on these ideas. So it's quite polyglot.
Yeah. Interesting. Are there any other questions still?
There's one more here that's come to me privately.
Yes.
And after Naoroji, who carried his legacy? Is there any leader or person who did carry on work like him?
That's a very good question. Liberal nationalism kind of dies out by 1921, right? Or at least it no longer is the preeminent force in Indian nationalism. And Gandhian nationalism is quite different. But in many ways, people like Gandhi and Nehru built upon liberal nationalist ideals. The one thing I'm trying to explore in my next book, whenever I get the time to work on it, is kind of these commonalities and how the liberal tradition was passed on. Beyond, say, 1921. Certainly for the short term, people like Gokhale take up that torch. Gokhale adopts the idea of self-government, and he works very hard on that through his untimely death in 1915. But I think there were others who again took the idea of swaraj from Naoroji and interpreted it in much more radical ways. You can draw some links between Naoroji's career and what Gandhi's career eventually is like. I mean, even as late as 1931, when Gandhi is returning to India from Great Britain after the Round Table Conference, he's asked by someone on a boat on the way back, what do you think of Naoroji? Do you think he was quite moderate in comparison to what nationalism is today? Was he just a pro-imperialist? Whatever terms we love to throw at him today about people who were not as radical as we'd like to think they were. And Gandhi says no. For his era, he was radical for his times, and certainly someone like Naoroji was capable of evolving his ideas as he moved along, in his life. This is who Gandhi was also. I mean, Gandhi evolved his political views as Gandhi became older. He, like Naoroji, became more radical with every decade he lived. And so Gandhi said, look, if Naoroji were alive today, he'd probably be following my stream of politics rather than, say, the politics he championed in his life, which I think is quite a telling statement that, when we think of a particular political actor, we think of them within a box. But in fact, they can represent a whole multitude of different political ideas. Gandhi began his life talking about, again, being a loyal subject of the Queen and pleading for rights. And at the end of his life, there's no mention of the Queen anywhere. So Naoroji was like that in many ways also. This kind of evolution and radicalism with time is something that I particularly like to stress in the book.
Now we have another question here from Thomas Buck. I found the Irish link fascinating. Were there any contacts later on?
Oh, yes. So the links between Irish and Indian nationalists continue, through 1920 and really up until 1947 in many ways. I mean, Valera, I think, was a very popular figure in India. There are a few books that have been written about, kind of the ties between Indian and Irish nationalists, and a lot of Irish individuals played quite a prominent role in Indian nationalism. I mean, think of Annie Besant, right? I mean, she was Anglo-Irish, or I think Sister Nivedita was also of Irish extraction, and there were quite a few other Irishmen who played roles here and there. And even if you look through Gandhi's papers, you see a lot of letters from Irishmen who say, we sympathize with your cause because we've been through the same thing.
And then to what extent can Naoroji's progressive internationalist nationalism be an alternative model for nationalism nowadays, well beyond India?
Again, I think it's highly relevant, in India, in a place like Britain, perhaps even, I mean, just the idea in a place like America or any other place which has gone through this kind of right-wing reaction of the past few years, in the sense that, again, it's quite open-minded. Even Scotland, yes. And actually, Naoroji had lots of relations with Scottish thinkers, especially those who were actually arguing for independence. He was in touch with, kind of the early Scottish separatist and independence leaders in the early 1900s. And of course, people like Keir Hardie as well. Again, the one thing that really interests me about Indian nationalism is that it has this very strong component, and this idea that Indian nationalism is about much more than just India itself, which is continued through up until Nehru, right? And then kind of it's there, but it trails off after Nehru. And I really think it's the ideas like that need to be revived. I mean, we've seen what us versus them does, right? In all these national contexts, there is a type of nationalism that is, much more pluralistic and cooperative. than the type of, blood and soil nationalisms that we see, unfortunately, returning to environments today. Particularly in Britain. My book unfortunately came out right when the pandemic started. So unfortunately, I haven't had much of a chance to talk about it in Britain, but I think there's great relevance for British politics for someone like Naoroji, because, here you have really the first Asian political actor, and given the power of Asians in Britain right now, and the fact that, there are Asian ministers in the government right now, and people who Naoroji would probably not agree with, but nevertheless are holding very powerful positions. It's a good time to think about how this, political process and the involvement of Asians in British politics began. And it began with Naoroji to a very high degree.
Perhaps on this note, could you tell us a little bit about your next book?
Sure. So, I began writing the next book once the archives shut here in India. So, and it's kind of gone in fits and starts. But I'm looking at early nationalism at large. In most historical scholarship, the period before Gandhi is kind of written off. It's changing now, but it still is written off to a large degree. It's thought of as being mendicant, ineffective, and in many ways it's not, right? Scholars like S.R. Mehrotra were people who kind of went against the grain and showed that no, it's actually very important and historically very rich. And I kind of want to follow in that footpath and talk about, what Indian nationalism was like before Gandhi. So, the provisional title is India is actually, not to borrow Ram Guha's title and twist it around, but India before Gandhi, the liberals and the making of Indian nationalism, and how people like, say, Alan Octavian Hume, Dutt, Ranade, Gokhale, how they contributed to a very distinct nationalist ideology that still has resonance today. When we think of a lot of the components of the modern Indian state, or at least the ideals that India wants and thinks it lives up to, like democracy, freedom of the press, some semblance of human rights, development, which of course was a huge priority in the 50s and 60s, this all begins with the early nationalists. These guys are developing these ideas. Legal reform, police reform is still hotly talked about today in India. Well, it's a topic of discussion in the Congresses of the 1880s. So, there's a lot to talk about. Female suffrage. Female suffrage is first discussed in an Indian National Congress session, I think in 1887. And there are women participating in the Congress, 35 years before any woman is allowed to vote in the British Parliament.
And now we have one more question or two from DJ. How Naoroji would have responded to farmers' protests in India today?
That's a difficult question to answer, partially due to my ignorance about the Farm Bill and precisely what is going on today. Certainly Naoroji was someone who believed at the very heart of his political conviction that the ultimate goal of government was to make sure that India grew less poor, and that that process of reducing poverty began at the very bottom. So it would, I think you would sympathize with what's going on, but as to what his opinions would be about the specifics of the legislation, I'm not sure.
Well, Dinya, we have thrown lots of different questions at you, and we have to thank you very much for having answered them all so well and assiduously and clearly. And also, we should all thank you for your wonderful presentation, for sharing your insights into the significance of Dadabhai Naoroji and his amazing mind and thinking. And so I think we can, all that remains is to give you a big applause if we can.
Thank you.
Unmute ourselves and just applause.
So I'll just end by, first of all, thanking again. I'd like to thank the Ancient Indian Iran Trust and Almat and Nisha for organizing and hosting this event. And I'll just say, as I mentioned, this book came out during the pandemic, so I really didn't have much of a chance to engage with British audiences, but there's a lot to say. So if there are those of you who are members of, either departments or organizations who are interested in a talk in Naoroji, I am giving talks, and I'd love to talk more to British audiences, because I think there is a lot of relevance for his story with British politics, both contemporary and the longer historical trajectory as well.
Indeed.
So thank you again for participating.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everybody. Good night. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Hey.